Outlook in Argentina. We are going to talk about the outlook in Argentina. And before I pass on directly to Monica, let me introduce her to you very briefly. If you haven't seen the profile that included in the invitation to this event, Monica is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington, D.C. Since January 2017, she's a former director of the Latin American Studies program at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and she was also a resident senior fellow at the Institute between March 2015 and January 2017. Monica is a honor economist. She was named a honor economist in 2014 by the Order of Brazilian Economists for her contributions to the Brazilian policy debate. She focuses on macroeconomics, foreign exchange, monetary and fiscal policy, trade and inequality, financial regulation, and capital markets. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Monica explained into public health research and has also specialized in immunology, genetics, and biochemistry. She has a degree at Harvard Medical School, and she's currently pursuing an advanced graduate degree in infectious disease and human immunology at Georgetown University. She has a degree in the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. She's a managing partner at Galanto MBB Consultant, and she has also studies in the London School of Economics. So Monica de Bolle is clearly qualified to discuss issues in Latin America, particularly in Argentina. And with no further ado, please, Monica, the floor is yours. So thank you very much for joining.
Well, thank you very much, Francisco, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the SFA Society in Mexico City for inviting me to speak about this very timely topic, Argentina, dollarization, and everything else that's going on there. It's a lot. So what I will do is I'll make some remarks, which will probably last about 10 to 15 minutes, hopefully. Sometimes I can be a little talkative. And just to summarize my initial views, and then we can get into a sort of exchange and a conversation about these topics, because I think there's a lot actually to explore. So let me start by just going back over the past few days, because we've had a lot of announcements in Argentina over the course of this week, actually. And we are learning, we are gradually learning, actually not gradually, we're learning very fast what the Milei government intends to do, at least initially. So the first thing, and I think the most important thing, is to say that this is a conference, or this is a talk about dollarization. However, the Milei government has, for the moment or for the time being, put dollarization on the back burner. So dollarization is not on the table at the moment. However, there's a reason for us to discuss it, and I'll get to that a little bit later in these initial remarks that I have for you. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that, as you all know, Milei has obviously appointed, and everyone's already working, his economic team. And the Minister of the Economy, Luis Caputo, he made several announcements in recent days, and he outlined very clearly, he made a very good speech actually on, I'm lost now, but on Tuesday night, I think it was, outlining his diagnosis of the Argentinian problem, or the Argentinian macroeconomic problem. And then he went on to lay out a series of measures, some of which they have already started taking. So those measures include not just the ones that are directed at reducing Argentina's fiscal deficit by a sizable amount. So Milei wants to reduce the fiscal deficit by 5 percentage points of GDP, as you've probably heard. There are a number of measures that were announced by Minister Caputo that kind of go in that direction. Some of them are politically difficult. So there are measures such as reducing the federal government transfers to the Argentinian provinces. This is going to be a hard one to pass, because obviously the provinces are politically influential and they have a lot of influence in Congress. But it is a critical measure, because there is a lot of spending that goes to the Argentinian provinces. So that's an important one if one wants to do that much of reduction in the overall fiscal deficit. And then there were a number of other measures that went in the same direction, but he went beyond the announcement of fiscal deficit measures. He also announced the devaluation of the peso, and the peso has already devalued, and in fact is somewhat volatile, as one would expect in these first few days. He announced the removal of price controls that had been in place under Fernandez. The removal of these price controls has already led to significant price increases, especially of food prices, but other goods as well, other staple goods. So people are already feeling not just the pinch, because it's not really a pinch, it's more like a slap, and a very hard one at that, coming from a situation where inflation is already extremely high. So inflation in Argentina at the moment, by my calculations, is around 146, 147% annually. But there is a lot of repressed inflation in the system. And this is where the removal of price controls, for example, comes in. Also, the reduction of transport subsidies, electricity subsidies, and fuel subsidies, which were in place under the Fernandez administration. That's also a source of repressed inflation that is going to bump inflation up in the coming months. This measure is due to come into effect in the 1st of January, so it hasn't come into effect yet. And then the third part of this, of course, is the devaluation of the peso, which does weigh on inflation. So if we actually look at Argentinian inflation right now, yes, it's 146, 147% if we do the calculations by the numbers that we currently have. But the situation is an evolving one. It's a fluid situation. It's evolving very fast. And these inflation numbers are going to rise very rapidly in the coming weeks. So by the time we get to, let's say, mid-January, we will have seen, I would say, probably the full effect of the removal of price controls, the devaluation of the peso, and the reduction in the subsidies, which is coming at the beginning of 2024. And by then, I would not be surprised if we're looking at an inflation rate, an annual inflation rate that is hovering around 300% of GDP. Oh, 300% per year. So this is where the situation in Argentina, then when we look at it from, where we are now, this is where the situation in Argentina becomes extremely complicated, because the way by which the authorities and the government officials and the president himself have gone about talking about the measures that they're doing comes from, or is premised on, the idea that Argentina needs to avoid falling into a hyperinflationary spiral, but that it is not there yet. So in other words, a lot of these measures, the ones meant to curb the fiscal deficit in particular, but then there are other measures as well that they're putting in place, the whole idea of not allowing the central bank to monetize deficits anymore, and so on. All of this is meant to, yes, fix the problems that Argentina currently has, but, in essence, to prevent Argentina from falling into hyperinflationary territory. I see a problem with that interpretation of the facts, because when we look, as I said before, at the actual inflation numbers and what's coming with the measures that they've been taking, the correct measures that they've been taking, Argentina is already in hyperinflationary territory. Let me do a parenthesis here and a little bit of a digression. We do not have in macroeconomics, we do not have a scientific definition of hyperinflation. But hyperinflation is the kind of thing that at one point an important politician said about, sorry to use it, but said about pornography. You may not be able to define it exactly, but you know it when you see it. And the hyperinflationary problem in Argentina is very much that. You do know it when you see it, and we are seeing it. So then the question becomes, are the measures that the government has announced, are they enough? Are they enough to contain and to actually eliminate the hyperinflationary problem? And here's where I have a perspective on this, which is kind of unique because I come from, and I remember this experience extremely well. I come from a country that had 20 years of hyperinflation. I'm Brazilian. And I lived in Brazil, and I was living in Brazil throughout most of that history. At the time that Brazil was having its hyperinflationary problems, Argentina was also having its hyperinflationary problems. The difference between the two is that the hyperinflation in Argentina was interrupted. It was never eliminated, so it was always there in the background, and this is why it's showing up now. But it was interrupted in 1991 with Cavallo's convertibility plan. In Brazil, the situation went in a different direction. So Brazil tried and failed 6 times in trying to end hyperinflation, and it only succeeded in 1994 with the Real Plan, which was very different from everything else that had been tried in the past. Before the Real Plan, and this is really important because the reforms for the Real Plan were so deep and so difficult that you really needed to have a very dramatic, awful situation on the ground in order for there to be political and popular consensus for the kinds of measures that had to be put in place. So on the eve of the Real Plan in Brazil, inflation was 4,900% per year, which, when we think about that, we can't even, know what that is. So put it in monthly terms. In monthly terms, that was more or less equivalent to 80% inflation per month, which is just about, prices doubling or almost that, prices doubling every month. If prices are doubling every month, it means that they're rising substantially every single day. And when you live in that kind of environment, very quickly your daily life becomes absolutely unmanageable because you simply don't know how much money you're going to have in the next 24 hours. It's not even a question of getting to the end of the month because inflation is just corroding whatever money you actually have very, very quickly. So that's the story, the backstory for Brazil and Brazil's hyperinflation. The other story that I think is important and that we saw both in Brazil and in Argentina is that hyperinflation is a very nonlinear process, right? So the moment you fall into hyperinflationary territory, inflation rises exponentially. It no longer has, everything loses a reference point. So one critical issue about hyperinflation that because we had it 40 years ago in South America, we don't really remember anymore. But it is very much a feature of hyperinflation, but not a feature of other instances of high inflation, is the fact that relative prices have no meaning once you've fallen into hyperinflation. So, in other words, you start to lose your reference points, and you can have, the prices of certain goods, they stop making sense. In other words, something that you would think should cost less than something else. So say you have product A and product B, and in principle you think A should be more costly than B. Well, prices are so wacky and things are they're rising so fast and in such a disorderly manner that suddenly you realize that actually B costs more than A. Or even if you have the same good A, and you're looking to buy it, if you go to store X, you're going to find good A at a certain price. But if you go to store Y, you're going to find the exact same good at a completely different price because prices have ceased to make sense in that environment. So this is a characteristic feature of hyperinflation. And this is going to happen in Argentina because if prices rise as fast as I was saying, so if inflation goes from its already high level of 146% per year as it is now to say 300 by mid-January or end January, we're exactly in that situation of prices rising extremely fast and in a very disorderly way, and relative prices go out the window in that situation, which means that, you know, when relative prices go out the window, you have to start looking for alternatives, and I'll get to them in a moment. Dollarization is one of them. That's why I said it's on the back burner for now, but it'll likely come back because the hyperinflationary problem in Argentina is already a reality. It's not something that, you know, may or may not happen, which is how the authorities have construed the situation. So that's one of the first points, or very important points, that I wanted to leave with you in these opening remarks. The second point is that fiscal adjustment, no matter how big or how dramatic or how draconian they might be, they are insufficient to face hyperinflations. They're necessary, so you need to have them as part of the package, but they alone will not resolve the problem because hyperinflation is an illness of the currency. I mean, basically, when you reach the hyperinflationary scenario, your currency is dead. In other words, nobody trusts it anymore. No one wants to hold that currency because they don't believe that it has any value. It no longer has value. And when relative prices, as I was saying before, have lost their meaning, it means that the currency has lost one of its main functions, which is to be a unit of account. It's the unit under which you quote prices. Well, if you can't trust the prices that are quoted under that currency, then the unit of account function is gone. And this is where you start to need, and it arises endogenously, indexation mechanisms. These indexation mechanisms can be the use of a hard currency like the dollar, which Argentina did use back in the 1980s and continue to use ever since in a very informal way. Or it can be the adoption of other indexation mechanisms. And here Brazil is the poster child of this, because Brazil had something like 6 or 7 different price indices that it used to index different contracts and different prices of different goods, you know, when hyperinflation was all the rage. And that's how actually hyperinflation survived for so long, is because, you know, you substituted the unit of account with an indexation mechanism, and that just kept things going. So second point, we will be talking about dollarization again because the hyperinflation situation in Argentina is already real. Third point, and then I will leave it at the third point so that we can have a discussion. Third point, what is superior, or what is it that Argentina could do that would be superior to dollarization? Because there are several issues with dollarization, right? I mean, starting with the fact that if Argentina wanted to dollarize right now, it would not have the capability to do that. For a country to dollarize or to adopt another country's currency over which it has no issuance power whatsoever, that country needs to be able to credibly say to people that it is going to be able to extend credit and honor the value of the dollars in circulation. And in order to do that, it needs to have some kind, the central bank needs to have some kind of constant supply of dollars that's coming into the country. And obviously that comes in through the balance of payments. This isn't the situation in Argentina right now. In fact, as we all know, Argentina does not even have, you know, when you look at net reserves in Argentina, net reserves are in negative territory. So it can't dollarize. Will it be able to dollarize in 2 to 3 months? No. Will it be able to dollarize in 6 months? No. I mean, it's all about credibility building, and the reforms and the fiscal adjustment that's been put in place right now takes time. I mean, even if you're doing a shock treatment kind of approach, which is what Milei is insisting upon, it takes time for people to see that those measures have taken effect. And we are here assuming that the political system in Argentina and the population at large are not going to react to those measures, which is a very big if, because if they do, then the measures, some of them are going to be watered down, and the effects are going to be much less than what we currently think, or much less than the 5 percentage points of GDP of adjustment that Milei has been talking about. So in a hyperinflation, you need to do all of this, all of these things, all of these fiscal adjustments and reforms and everything else. But on top of that, you need to do a currency reform, because the currency that you have, as I said, is as good as dead. It serves no purpose. It's a hyperinflationary currency that serves no purpose. Hyperinflation doesn't have a means of sort of reversing itself. It doesn't reverse itself. So a better way for Argentina than dollarization would be the implementation of something very similar to what Brazil did in 1994, would be the implementation of a real-like plan, obviously adapted to the circumstances on the ground in Argentina. That way they can keep their own currency, so they don't have the problems of having someone else's currency, and thus in the future having no monetary policy and no exchange rate policy of their own, while at the same time, retaining the ability to issue their own money, and everything that comes with that we know comes with having your own currency. So, but we're not there. The discussions in Argentina right now do not envisage, these steps, or steps in the direction of adding a currency reform, adding the deep sort of institutional reforms that you need in order to have a currency reform that people trust. Because the moment you do something like that, you basically create a system where you have two currencies. You have the hyperinflationary currency, the peso, and you have some other currency that you've created. This is what Brazil did. And that currency is backed by institutions that can now sustain it without causing hyperinflation. And then you need to build trust in this other currency in order for it to be left intact and in order for it to survive, which is what was done with the real. Once you've done that, then you can move away from the hyperinflationary currency and have, the other one in place. But Argentina is very far from that point, and very far from discussing all that would be needed for them to have that kind of situation. So what I fear will happen is that maybe in 2 months, maybe in 3, I don't know how long, but I think it's going to be fairly quick. We are going to be in the middle of chaos again, complete chaos. Inevitably, there's going to be a lot of social upheaval because the measures that are being taken are very harsh. And the dollarization talk is going to come back, but in the midst of a much more fragile, vulnerable, and confusing situation than the one we have right now. So it's going to be a fascinating case to watch. And we will have to see, if heads can come together to sort of do the things that need to be done, and to have the recognition that, look, this isn't, hyperinflation isn't a hypothetical, it's a reality. And so ideally, you would have to be dealing with it right now. If not right now, then in a month, because there's not much time. So thank you. And I'm open to your questions, and to, I hope, will be a rich exchange.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Monica. And to your point, like, Argentina is always a fascinating country to watch from afar. And I really hope and look forward that they will be able to get out of this situation. I have 2 questions before we open up to our friends in the audience. So the first question is, like, to your point about net reserves, if they need to start accumulating reserves to be able to discuss dollarization seriously, they basically need to increase their exports, right? And the Argentine economy is not very competitive, and it's not very complex when you look at their export matrix. So it seems that at this point, in order for them to be able to accumulate reserves, they need a Deus ex machina, like they had in the 2000s when China was basically buying all the soy they were producing. So absent that, what can they do to start increasing reserves? So that would be question number one. And then one second question is, it seems to me that one of the reasons why Milei was so popular and why the dollarization debate is gaining so much attractiveness in the media is because of this idea that it basically cuts the spending arm of the government, right? Like, once you dollarize, you are not able to spend like crazy because your money is pegged to a hard currency and you just can't. But I don't think that's the case really, because if you look at Ecuador, they were dollarized and they defaulted. You look at El Salvador, they dollarized and I don't remember if they defaulted or it was very close to that. So
Yeah.
what do you make about that argument about that dollarization can really like tame the beast of state spending? And then after that we will open up to questions by our
Okay.
audience.
So two very good questions, Francisco. So on the first one, you're right. Argentina is not in a position to gain much in terms of reserves from its export base. In fact, if we look at what's happened it's like Brazil in many ways. The Argentinian export base has become, and everyone in Latin America has gone that route, except for you guys, except for Mexico. Everybody has become more commodity intense in terms of their export base, and Argentina is not an exception. Meaning that they do need commodity prices to be extremely high in order for them to have any chance of building reserves, and that just isn't in the cards. That just isn't going to happen. So that's, I think, one critical point. Now, if we think about other sources of, let's say, dollars to Argentina, there's the IMF. The IMF, Argentina and the IMF, I don't know if everybody realizes how many they've been, but it's been 21 programs. They've had 21 programs with the IMF. They will likely have a 22nd because the fund is going to need to pay itself back, right? Argentina is not going to pay the fund. So the fund's going to need to pay itself back. Likely there's going to be an IMF program. So they'll have the 22nd program at some point. But the IMF is not in a position to supply Argentina with the dollars that it needs to dollarize. Neither would the IMF support such a thing. There would be a major outcry on the fund's board if it ever, it would never do that. But I worked at the IMF. I worked on the Argentinian crisis back in 2001. At the time, I was working also on the Uruguayan crisis because it was a direct result of the Argentinian one. And Uruguay had a banking crisis that was the result of Argentina. And the fund at the time was not willing to give Uruguay any money, even though by no fault of their own, they were having a balance of payments crisis caused by a dollarized banking system. So, these issues are complicated. And of course, the fund is not going to back dollarization in that way. So that's out. What about China? Well, China was, before the elections, giving the Argentinians some help. The Chinese had started, and they've been doing it. They've been doing this with other countries too. So the Chinese have been using the central bank swap lines, which, as we all know, is a very specific way of, transacting between two central banks. It's not a loan, but the Chinese have been using their swap lines almost like a government to government loan. This is how they've been operating it for several countries. And they did that with Argentina. And they even did it right before the first round of the elections, to boost, Massa, to boost Sergio Massa. And, given that that was the more friendly candidate to China. But, so there's China, but China would not give Argentina the dollars that it needs. I mean, that would not happen either. So in essence, we're left with no real, I mean, there's just no way that you can magically turn around a situation in a country that has negative net reserves into a country that has very positive and a very high stock of international reserves practically from one day to the next in order to engineer dollarization. So the answer to your first question, Francisco, is it won't happen. It won't
Well,
happen.
that's the good short side of it. It just won't happen.
It
So
just won't happen. Your second question, I fully agree with your point. Um, the whole idea that, you know, when you dollarize, then you have cut off a means of deficit financing, which, you know, makes your deficit shrink because the deficit financing is no longer there, um, is very naive. I mean, this was so Milei was selling this on the campaign trail, right? He was saying, look, if we dollarize, the central bank is no longer going to be able to issue anything to give to the treasury to pay down deficits because they can't issue dollars. And therefore, you know, you have the treasury not having a way to run deficits and finance them is just going to stop, you know, and spending and everything else is just going to fall dramatically. And we resolve the problem of very high deficits that way. Dollarization solves all our deficit problems. Well, it doesn't, right? I mean, we know that. We know that from the cases that you cited. Ecuador was the first that came to my mind, but of course there is a case of El Salvador as well. And you know, you name it, you can see it. I mean, if you look at the Eurozone, okay, it's a different issue, but look at Greece, you know, back in 2010. Look at Italy and Spain, and you know, they all had euros. They couldn't issue their own currency. The issue was not theirs to issue, and nonetheless, they had very high deficits and very high debt. So, dollarizing or adopting a currency that you have no power to issue does not preclude or does not prevent you from having high deficits and high debt. So that is just, you know, not true. And therefore, dollarization is not the end all for Argentinian deficits by any stretch of the imagination.
no, thank you. And deficit, I mean, fiscal policy at the end is the result of multiple equilibria among different actors of the economy. And as long as they don't get solved, uh, you know, deficit will just keep happening. And that brings us back to your point about the willingness of the population and political institutions to handle the adjustments that are required. So
Yeah.
with that, and unless you want to add something else, Monica, let us open up to questions from the audience. Please introduce yourself and keep your remarks brief to maximize the participation of all the members. Thanks.
We have one question about Eliasaga. You have stated that dollarization is unviable. You also talk about the way Brazil created a stable separate currency as a way out of hyperinflation. What do you think is the way for Argentina?
So I do believe that the way for Argentina is similar to Brazil's. It's not the same because, of course, they're different countries. They are in very different positions and very different situations. But the overall solution is very similar. And the solution is to take the Real Plan. The Real Plan has a lot of lessons in it. Take the Real Plan and adapt it to the circumstances in Argentina. The Real Plan in Brazil was very complicated because Brazil had, as I was mentioning before, these indexation mechanisms that it built endogenously in order to live with hyperinflation for such a long time. The problem, therefore, was that the Real Plan had to not just build a new trustworthy domestic currency, but to do that, it had to do away with a number of things, including the indexation mechanisms that were in place. And the indexation mechanisms were extremely complex because there were numerous indices indexing various things. Prices did not get adjusted by these indices at the same time. They were staggered over time. So addressing that was one of the major issues. And this is why, and I will now resuscitate something that some of you probably remember, but many of you probably forgot, the one artifice that Brazil used, which was extremely, it was actually the linchpin of the Real Plan. People think of other things when they think of the Real Plan rather than this, but this was the linchpin. So Brazil created this thing called the URV. The URV was the Unidade Real de Valor. And the URV did not exist as a currency. The URV was actually a virtual currency created in an analogical era, which makes it really interesting. In fact, when we look at that aspect of the Real Plan, and the URV, but the URV became the main indexator, or the main index that served for all contracts and all prices. So when that transition happened, basically what the Brazilian government did was say, okay, all the indexation mechanisms that we currently have, they're gone. We're going to index prices and contracts and wages and everything to the URV. And the URV had a value, it was a remunerated currency, and it had a value that fluctuated every day according to the fluctuation of the exchange rate between the dollar and the Cruzeiro Real, which was the currency then, and a few other things, a few other indices, monetary correction mechanisms that were in place at the time. So there was a formula, a daily formula for the calculation of the variation of the URV. And because the URV became the index, it became the unit of account. And it wasn't inflationary because all of the inflation was in the Cruzeiro Real. So what happened was that as people became used to the idea of this URV, this thing that was indexing everything else, but wasn't itself inflationary, people started to accept that there was a way, indeed, to live without inflation, as long as you got rid of the Cruzeiro Real at some point. So then the next phase of the Real Plan was to say, okay, at such and such date, we are going to convert every single Cruzeiro Real in existence into URVs, and those URVs will become reais. They'll become the currency. And at that moment, we will do the full transition from the physical currency to the virtual to the other physical currency, the one that's not hyperinflationary. So that was the linchpin of the Real Plan. Argentina can do the same thing. They can do the same thing. And it, in fact, is probably simpler to do in Argentina because you don't have as many indexation mechanisms to break. So in other words, you can take the template of the Real Plan in Brazil and adapt it to Argentina in such a way that you do, the sequence of reforms that are needed to sustain the new currency in a way that's very similar to what Brazil did then. Because there was nothing, apart from some things that were very specific to Brazil, like the indexation mechanisms and so on, the broad outline of the Real Plan is something that can be adapted anywhere. It's not, there's nothing about it that, you can only do in Brazil. No, you can apply it to the case of Argentina. So the way that I see it is that would be the best option for them, because then, if they're successful, they'll have moved from a hyperinflationary currency to a non-hyperinflationary currency, but it's their own currency. They're not giving up on their own currency.
Thank you. We have a Laura Herrera, please.
Yes, hi, Monica. Thank you for your presentation. It was really clear and very sad. I wanted to ask you about the political uncertainty right now. 8 years ago, Mauricio Macri was taking the government with this market-friendly approach, and it was like it was going to be enough, and it wasn't, clearly. So what do you think about now the coalition with PRO having such harsh measures right at the beginning? If it's going to fall apart, if they are going to be kind of enough, or maybe this political uncertainty is going to weigh even besides the economic situation? How do you perceive that?
So those are critical questions, and those are exactly the questions that we're struggling with, because to me, it looks like this. On the one hand, it's true that when you look at the elections and the way by which, Milei won, the population seems to have given him, I mean, it was really about getting rid of Kirchner, okay? Let's be just absolutely clear about that. First and foremost, it was about removing Kirchner, Christina. But because the element of because the Argentinians have been living with this chaotic economic situation for so long, it was also about the economy, and it was also about do whatever you need in a certain way. Do whatever you need to get us to an economic situation that's more normal, as compared to what we've been living with over the last few years. Now, the big question here, I think, is that a mandate or a popular mandate that's been given to Milei in order for him to implement the very harsh measures that he has announced, or not? They're interpreting that, or they're answering that question as a yes. So they're interpreting, the amount of votes that they got and the way by which the elections played out as a resounding yes. Yes, the population is ready. Yes, the population wants us to do this. And in fact, it wasn't by chance that the entire inaugural speech that Milei gave was about the economy. In fact, I thought that was extraordinary, because you never see an inaugural speech like that. I mean, for me, that was a first, where an elected president who was being called a populist, and probably is one, on the campaign trail, wins, does an inaugural speech that's zero populist, where he begins by saying, I'm not here to tell you, I'm here to tell you inconvenient truths. I'm not here to tell you, this is literally what he said, I'm not here to tell you comfortable lies. And then he laid right into, the problems that Argentina has and what needs to be done to fix it. And so they're very much interpreting that they have a mandate to do all of these things. Now, they probably do. It's early days. It's the first week. In the first week, they have a mandate. The question is, do they still have it in the third week or the fourth week or the fifth week, when the population is really going to start to feel, their empty pockets continue to be empty? Because people want solutions, but they want them fast. They don't want to have to wait. And even though, there was a lot of talk about, I mean, Milei stressed this a lot, and so did Caputo in his speech. They stressed a lot the fact that these things take time. It's not going to be immediate. It's going to be, probably 2 years of economic pain. They're being very optimistic, because it's probably a lot more than 2 years, but 2 years of economic pain, blah, blah. It's one thing to say these things and for people to hear it, and in the spur of the moment where there was a change and they finally got the change they wanted, for them to accept it. It's a different thing altogether when the pain is real, they're feeling it and they're not liking it. So there is to me, it's almost 100% chance that very soon we are going to start seeing social upheaval in Argentina, and that this is going to be yet another problem for the ability to implement the reforms and the adjustments that have been announced, and inflation, because in the background we're gonna have prices doing whatever they're going to be doing. I mean, imagine if on top of everything, Argentina is in a situation where prices are rising by, I don't know, at first maybe 10% per month, but then 20, then 30, then 40. That's how hyperinflations go. And then that turns into complete turmoil very, very quickly. That's my fear.
Thank you. I have another question. What would be the critical actions to prevent this new currency to have hyperinflation as well?
So the critical actions are in part what the government has already announced. So yes, they do need the deep fiscal adjustment that they've announced. They do need the reforms that they have announced. They do need to go down that path. They need more reforms in addition to those, and they need something that is politically impossible. But I will mention it because that's what they need to do. They need to control the provinces. The federal government needs to have control over the provinces. And when I say control over the provinces, it isn't enough to say that the federal government is going to reduce the transfers to the provinces. I mean, that is going, one step in the right direction. But what's really needed in the case of the provinces is they need to have fiscal responsibility legislation. So you need to have fiscal responsibility laws at the provincial level so that they no longer have the kind of autonomy that they currently have to do whatever they want in terms of spending and debt issuance. You can't have, at the moment, you could still have provinces issuing patacones at some point if they decided to reinvent and resuscitate the patacones. That's perfectly possible, in the case of Argentina, because of the autonomy that these provinces have. So you need that kind of reform. Now, that's a political reform. And that is a very hard sell, I mean, to say the least, right? In order for you to build a consensus to reach, the ability to do something like that, the situation has to get way worse than it is right now, so that people accept that, this course of action is needed. And so, it's a long way.
Just to add on that, on the subnational government dimension, Monica, you're totally right. And one of the reasons why the 1990s convertibility plan fell apart was because the central government was kind of okay. If you look at their fiscal balances, they were kind of okay in the late 1990s. And it was the provincial situation that went totally out of control. So yeah, a fiscal responsibility law may be necessary for the Argentinian provinces to be on top. And then when you look also at the particular situation of Argentina, where 30% of the population is in the Buenos Aires urban area, really you are talking about the issue of controlling the province of Buenos Aires, which for people who are more familiar with Mexico is the equivalent of the state of Mexico. It's the area that surrounds the city of Buenos Aires, that has a very big political cloud, and that Milei and his coalition haven't been able to really tap deep into. So, and that moves a lot of votes. They control the state. The province police has a lot of influence about what they can do and what they cannot do, what kind of protests they allow or they don't. So, really, more than the external, I mean, they everything need to focus on the external and the fiscal front and all of that. But to your point, like, what really brings down Argentina is the unsolvable political economy between Buenos Aires and the rest of the country.
Exactly.
Yeah. We have 10 minutes, so if somebody wants to take the floor, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and be brief.
I think there's one in the chat.
Yeah.
Here.
So yeah, I will read out loud. It was posted by my friend Ignacio Montané. Great talk, Monica, about the argument of the need for economic shock therapy to reduce the deficit. Are you aware or do you know of any example of a country in a similar situation where a gradualist approach has worked in the long term? Finding one example is quite difficult given the economic, political, and social pressures to make it work. So is there any examples of gradual approach? I mean, Macri tried before and it didn't work, but do you know anywhere else in the world that might have worked?
Ignacio, unfortunately, no, and especially not in our part of the world. In our part of the world, gradualism usually becomes, or let's put it this way, gradualism is usually gradually abandoned as gradualism goes by, right? As time goes by. So the tendency is, you start off with these good intentions. You're gonna do, the adjustment that needs to be done, and like Macri in 2015, announcing that he was going to be gradualist. He didn't want to inflict the Argentinians with a lot of pain right from the get-go, and that he would stick to those policies and he would follow through and all of that. Politically, it doesn't work. It's a time inconsistent strategy from a political standpoint. It never works. I mean, it sounds very nice when you announce it, but politically, the obstacles and the issues are always going to come up that are going to require, at the end of the day, the president and the government to end up spending more than they wanted to, and gradualism therefore starts to be gradually eroded. So usually, no, the gradualism approach does not work. It certainly doesn't work in our country. So in Argentina, with its very fragmented, congressional and political structure, and in Brazil as well, with its very fragmented and political structure, gradualism simply has never worked. I mean, both countries tried in the 1970s and the 1980s. It was all the rage to discuss, shock therapy versus gradualism in Brazil and Argentina, because those two countries were facing very similar problems, and they were, sort of, having the same crisis one after the other. So Argentina would have a crisis, then Brazil would have a crisis, then Argentina would have a crisis, then Brazil would have a crisis, and it would go on and on and on and on like that. And so the whole shock therapy versus gradualism became a thing, and several governments at the time tried one and the other. Gradualism usually failed. Shock therapy usually failed as well, but for different reasons. And the reasons at the time had more to do with the fact that hyperinflation was not being properly addressed than anything else. So in the end, shock therapy failed because the plans that were attempted to bring hyperinflation down were not good enough, and they didn't deliver the goods. So in other words, they did deliver for a while, but then they failed. Hyperinflation came back, and it was done. So that was it. And then the only time when then shock therapy did work was when it was announced in the context of a plan that actually worked to fight hyperinflation, and that was the Real Plan in 1994. That's the example that we have, at least in the region, right? I mean, if we were to look elsewhere, but even if we looked elsewhere, we won't find it. So, for example, Israel had very high inflation. In fact, they had a hyperinflation. They ended theirs with shock therapy. They didn't end it with gradualism. And they tried gradualism as well, and it failed there too. So, you go back on these cases and you can't really find one. When the situation is this bad, it just, it's not politically feasible. And it will, at some point, it just won't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, gradualism doesn't work because at the end of the day, there are elections every now and then.
Exactly.
And, you can't win with with that sort of stuff. So we have one final question, and then probably we can do a quick summary. Oh, sorry, Juan Partida, you raised your hand. So if it was not an accident, please go ahead.
Thanks, Francisco. So is it fair to say that this shock therapy, if not accompanied by a successful hyperinflation control mechanism, could result in things getting worse and probably ending up in a political crisis?
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely correct. And that is exactly the fear that I have for Argentina, because you see, what happens with hyperinflation is that it's too uncontrolled and too fast for any kind of fiscal adjustment to catch up to it. So in other words, you can try to do the fiscal adjustment as a way to bring hyperinflation down, but it won't do it. It can't. It won't. It won't because it's not fast enough, and it won't because the issue with hyperinflation is an issue of trust. And then the moment that doesn't work, then the whole house of cards comes crumbling down, right? Because the government has sold everyone on the idea that this would work. People put up with the pain in order for it to work. It didn't work, and then boom, And then, yes, you get a social and political crisis like that.
Thank you.
You touch a very important point, Monica, which is the point of trust, and this takes us to the final questions which we have, which is by Elias, who says, at the end of the day, inflation is a problem of trust and perception. If the government can build it quickly, the problem will be solved just because people believe it will. The question is, does the Argentinian government of Milei have what it takes to create trust out of thin air? The problem and the solution are both self-fulfilling prophecies. And let me give you my take, and then probably you can jump in. At one point, the problem is not the government of Milei, but when you have a country like Argentina that has defaulted 14 times, like you can create at best trust for 4 years, maybe even 2 if he ends up doing badly in the midterms. So that's my take, Monica. But please, if you have a different opinion, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I fully agree. I think when you have exactly that, when you have a history of financial crises that are ever repeating, right? And then on top of the same sort of Groundhog Day financial crisis that you relive every 5 years, on top of that, you now have hyperinflation, then, the trust issue is just, it's a Herculean task, right? To resolve. And so, yeah, I agree. It's much greater than the government that's currently in place, because it's a problem with the entire system.
Yeah. Yeah. So if there are no other questions, and I look across the room once, twice, 3 times. Thank you very much, Monica. You have been great. We'd love to have you again soon to keep discussing Argentina, LATAM, and other stuff. So if you would be happy to join us, we'd be happy to have you in the future.
Yes, absolutely. It was great. It was excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thanks.
And Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas to you, Monica.
And Merry Christmas and a happy 2024 to all of you. And hopefully I'll see you in the new year. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Happy holidays.